I suggest we get started. People are still coming in, but let's not let our keynote speaker wait too long. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this launch of the final conference series of the Jean Monnet network GOVTRAN. So today we launch a whole series, and you can find more information on the website of the GOVTRAN, GovTran.eu. GovTran is a Jean Monnet network that's jointly managed by 4 universities, the University of East Anglia, the University of Eastern Finland, the Flemish Free University of Brussels, and Ghent University. And for the past 3 years that we have enjoyed the Jean Monnet funding, we have looked at what the name GovTran stands for, namely governing the EU's climate and energy transition in turbulent times. Obviously, we are in turbulent times, and we can look at several phenomena there. We are living through geopolitical shifts, through social political divisions that are growing across Europe, broader legitimacy challenges of the European Union and of democratic governance more generally, the rise of populism and post-factualism, and we could probably add a few more, but these are a few of the phenomena that we have identified and worked on. You find a lot more on what GovTran has been doing, including our MOOC, our massive open online course on the GovTran website. But now to today's topic. The European Commission has obviously released, as you all know, its legislative proposals for implementing the EU's enhanced greenhouse gas emission reduction target of at least 55% by 2030 in July of this year, also known as the Fit for 55 package. This package comes on top after the adoption of the European climate law earlier in spring 2021, and also provides then the baseline for the subsequent consideration of the EU's further mission and policy trajectory towards achieving climate neutrality by 2050, which is in the European climate law. And obviously, we're aiming for negative emissions thereafter. That's also what the climate law says. So today's keynote serves hopefully to reflect a little bit on the broader repercussions of the legislative package and of the EU's move to climate neutrality in times that are characterized, as I just mentioned, by increasing turbulence in Europe and beyond. And it's my pleasure and honor to welcome Diederik Samsom, the head of cabinet of the first executive vice president, Frans Timmermans of the Commission, responsible for the European Green Deal and obviously in the lead on this package also, so that he could share his views on Fit for 55 and climate neutrality achievements and challenges in this broader turbulent context. I should also introduce already Claire Dupont, who is Assistant Professor of European and International Governance at Ghent University, and who will kick off then afterwards the discussion that we hope to have with all of you. So don't hesitate to put questions already in the Q&A button at the bottom, and or raise your hand after the keynote and after the comment to make your own comment, pose a question to the keynote speaker, so that hopefully we can have some lively debate afterwards. I think that's it for housekeeping. We would then give you the floor, obviously, and activate your mic. Yes, with this, and without further ado, Diederik Samsom, everybody is waiting for you to take the floor. Here it is. You have the floor.
Well, thank you, Sebastian. Well, thanks for having me on this digital platform. I was indeed asked to talk about the impact and the ramifications of the Fit for 55. But in order to do so, I have to take you all back to another era, which is called the Pre-Covet Era. Because when we presented the Green Deal in December 2019, we didn't know anything about what would happen 3 months after that. We presented the Green Deal at the start of the mandate of this new commission, and it was, well, I'm biased obviously, but I think it was well received. And I think it stood out from, let's say, normal environmental plans that you can receive dozens of from Brussels, especially, in three ways. It was different in three aspects. One, its ambition. For once, politicians didn't settle for the lowest common denominator, for the feasible. No, for once, we sat together and we thought, what is the urgency at hand? What is the science telling us, and what are the ambitions that we need to do, we need to meet in order to comply with that message from that scientists are telling us? And hence the big ambition of being climate neutral in 2050, but also to stop the loss of biodiversity altogether. Because if you could compare apples to oranges, the loss of biodiversity might be just as big or even a bigger threat to future generations than climate change. But also to stop pollution, further pollution of our water, our soil, and our air, because we've polluted enough. Those big ambitions were all in the Green Deal. And that's actually the second big difference with normal environmental policy. This was not a series of ideas and loose ends and plans one on transport and one on agriculture and then later one on nature and then a bit later on energy, and then you discover that some of that works against each other. No, this was one comprehensive idea, one vision, one plan to save our ecosystem. And come to think of it, that's pretty logical because we only have one ecosystem. And in that one ecosystem, everything is connected with everything else too, as we now endure in this pandemic. And the third difference was maybe the most important one. This was not an environmental strategy. This was a growth strategy. This was actually an economic plan. And I come from the environmental movement, so I remember pretty vividly that aspect of the Green Deal was received with some raised eyebrows by especially environmental NGOs, because how on earth can you combine such an environmental ambition with an ambition to have new momentum, new growth, new impetus in the European economy? And yet I do think that that was the main aspect of it that leads to the situation where we are right now. Because fast forward 3 months further on, COVID turned our lives upside down. It changed everything around us. And obviously the first emergency was our health crisis, and everybody dove into that. And I must admit that at that time, having produced the Green Deal, working on all the parts of it to bring that further down the road of the legislative pathway, I despaired a little, or actually a lot, because we've seen that before. Big ambitions, and then all of a sudden something comes by, takes all the capital, all the political capital, and maybe even all the financial capital, and there your vision, your ambition, your dot on the horizon is gone. We've seen that before. In 2008, Al Gore, the former presidential hopeful, walked into Europe with a movie. It was called An Inconvenient Truth. And while that movie was not very successful in his own country, it mesmerized the European public and the European leaders. I remember op-eds from Tony Blair and Balkenende, the Dutch prime minister, in the Financial Times, urging their fellow leaders to step up to the plate to fight climate change. This has opened our eyes and we needed to do something. And that happened. Some plans were made, some visions were created. And then Lehman Brothers fell apart. And the world tumbled into the financial crisis, the euro crisis, the debt crisis, and we haven't heard about An Inconvenient Truth anymore. There was a second part. Hardly anybody knows. And that was the threat this time too. Obviously, that could have happened. So you have that nice Green Deal, and all of a sudden COVID takes all the attention away. What is a more urgent matter than COVID? So it would be completely logical if the consequence would have been that the Green Deal would put in the lowest drawer that we could find, and we would focus our attention on other things. And yet that did not happen. And I think one of the reasons, there's more than one, but one of the reasons was that after a few weeks after the first shock, we started to raise ourselves up and looked at each other and thought, okay, what next? We need a growth strategy to recover from the crash, the economic crash that Corona brought on us. And there was just an economic growth strategy delivered. It was called the Green Deal. So instead of putting the Green Deal in the lowest drawer that we could find, we put the Green Deal on steroids. We added a 750 billion recovery package to it to spur the investments that were needed to do both things at the same time: recover from Corona, build a green economy. Because, well, that's no rocket science. If you want to rebuild your economy, you better build it back better at once, instead of building back the old stuff and then trying to transition it into the new stuff. So here we are in the, you could say, because it's difficult to say that COVID has a silver lining or something like that, but it led to a situation where the Green Deal is stronger than we were with the Green Deal when we published it. And normally that doesn't happen to strategies. Normally strategies go watered down all the way down to the finish line. And now we have a strengthened one. We're not there yet, because now Fit for 55 arrives, translating nice ambitions that everybody applauds into real consequences that nobody likes. That's actually the summary of the Green Deal. Translating that huge ambition that everybody admires into something that everybody hates. That's the job of politicians and policymakers. Don't be discouraged by it. It's the job we have to do. Translating the enormous ambition into legislation is pretty complicated too. Because, well, some of you studied economics or know a bit about it, and they know that if you have one goal, you need one instrument. Never use two instruments to reach one goal. It's what Nobel Prize winning economists tell us. Yes, that's fine in a theoretical world where we operate as perfect spheres in a vacuum, taking only rational decisions. Then you would be able to get that one goal, minus 55, climate neutrality, with one instrument. You just push the ball forward through the door. But in real life, we are not perfect spheres. We do not operate in a vacuum, and our decisions are not rational. So the better analogy is actually one of herding cats. Try to herd 27 cats through one door. Everybody who has tried that at home knows that even with 3 cats, you need to be all over the place. You need to be in front, in the back, in the middle, on the left and on the right. You need to be everywhere. And this is sort of what explains the Fit for 55 package. We couldn't just have the emission trading system and then done deal, go home. No, we have the emission trading system, but we also have the renewable energy directive. We have the infrastructure, because let me give you one example, only one of many sectors that we have to address here. Transport. Yes, you could say we only need one instrument, which is the CO2 emission standard. We just take that one down to 0. That's the funeral date of the internal combustion engine, and we're done. Well, no, we're not. We do this, but that's only the starting point. Because even if you would organize the funeral of the internal combustion engine tomorrow, there would still be tens of millions of cars on the road that will still be on the road for the next 15 to 20 years, using petrol, gasoline, diesel, whatever, all burning fossil fuels. And you don't get rid of those by building new cars electrical. So you need at the same time, and there you go into your second problem, you need to decarbonize those fuels. Well, you can do that by having the Renewable Energy Directive and just strengthen the target for renewable fuels. Yeah, you can. But then you have to take into account that those renewable fuels are most of the time made from biomass. And biomass is a fragile form of renewable energy. So you need to regulate the way we create, import, build our biomass inventory, sustainability criteria, sustainable forest management. A whole new chapter opens itself and new complications run into the room. And that's not even the whole story, because you can regulate the hell out of the transport sector. You also need to provide somehow a business case for those more expensive fuels. How are you going to manage that for the transport fuel producers, Shell, Total, Exxon, you don't have to have mercy on them, but okay. But more important for the consumer, because most of us are able to pay a little more for petrol at the gas station. Yes, most of us are. Not everyone is. And this is where the political question gets hot. It's called redistribution, the essence of politics. Redistribution. So you collect money from all of us and you redistribute it to a few. What's the best way to do that? Taxation. I hear you shouting. But taxation is a national instrument. So we could do that. We could have relied on member states and say, okay, if you want to do this, we regulate, you tax and redistribute. That's sort of the division of jobs between the European Commission and national governments. Yes, but you do not only need solidarity within a country, so redistribution within a country, but also between countries. Because if you would rely on this idea, you would tax in Luxembourg, you would redistribute in Luxembourg, because even in Luxembourg, there's people not being able to afford the energy bill. And then from Luxembourg, we wave good luck to Romania with a bigger challenge, a lower GDP per capita, and no possibilities to get this done. No, we need also within Europe, we need redistribution. And that's where the ETS extension, so broadening the ETS to other sectors, comes into play. Because it enables us as a European society to provide a business case for renewable, for sustainable fuels, heating fuels, transport fuels, collect public money and redistribute that to people in need, vulnerable households, but also to redistribute the effort amongst Europe from, let's say, countries like Luxembourg, the Netherlands, to Hungary, Croatia, and Poland. And you can imagine that that's going to be the heated debate within Europe. Trying to find the balance between the countries that hate to pay and the purpose that they love to pay for, because climate change is a shared challenge. And that's maybe one of the strong aspects of our design from the Green Deal to Fit for 55, because in between we had a climate law where we committed ourselves legally, every one of us, to the 55%. So now I hear a lot of countries and other stakeholders say, yeah, it's a nice package, but I don't like that part of it. One part, please get rid of that, and then we're fine. No, we're not. Because if we get rid of one part of the package, we do not meet that 55 target, and everyone is committed to that. So our conversation with the co-legislators, Council and Parliament, is actually very simple. We lean back, we are proud of our package, and we say, okay, if you don't like it and you want to take something out, go ahead. But provide an alternative that brings you to the same finish line in the end, with the same solidarity requirements, the same efficiency, etc. That's going to be the discussion of the next 1.5 years. But before I conclude, I want to jump one step further into the rest of the world, because I've just talked about 9% of the worldwide emissions. And saving planet Earth is not going to happen by reducing 9% of the emissions. We have to have a collective effort. And here is where Glasgow comes into play. Fit for 55, though, is very important as a showcase, as a way to show other developed nations that you shouldn't stick to just high ambitions. You should also operationalize them into real policies. And because of the EU doing that, shouldn't say inspire, because I don't think countries inspire each other, but we sort of provoke each other. In this case, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and yes, also the US. There was a change of administration needed, but okay, we got there. Also the US, to try and think this through and say, okay, if they can do it, can we do that too? That's not the whole basis of our success, obviously, because I have not mentioned one elephant in the room, or not in the room yet, China. Not a developed nation, formally, and you could also say informally, but still the GDP per capita of China is much lower than ours, although they're catching up fast. But obviously, in terms of emissions, the biggest culprit the biggest emitter on Earth. So we need to get them into the equation. And that's going to be our focus for the next 8 weeks up to Glasgow. Using our Fit for 55 as an example, but just putting it somewhere there as a showcase, and then work our asses off to get the rest of the world on the same stage with the same ambition. This morning, you might have listened to the State of the Union. Not every European does, but you're a selective company, a selective group, so maybe some of you have. And you might have heard that what the president announced was that in order to create movement towards Glasgow, not only our Fit for 55 is a showcase, but also our finance contribution to the developing and the most vulnerable countries in the world who are suffering from climate change needs to be stepped up. So we pledged another 4 billion euros to that commitment. But more importantly, we called upon the US, who is the biggest outlier here, doesn't pay a dime, and is actually the reason why we haven't fulfilled our promise of 100 billion euros a year for the developing world. We urge them to step up, to commit their finance, to pledge their part of the whole deal, and then we can go to Glasgow with our 100 billion. But before going to Glasgow, we will, with our 100 billion, we will go to China and say, okay, we've now fulfilled our commitment. We've reduced, or we have the ambition to reduce our emissions. We have committed the 100 billion. It's up to you now. You have to commit to a higher ambition to reduce your emissions quicker than you thought, more drastically than you anticipated. If we have those elements, so the US paying up, the China fulfilling more ambition, then we have the ingredients for successful Glasgow. Just a few ingredients. We need a lot more, and that's why EVP Timmermans will not be at home anymore between now and Glasgow, because he will travel the world to talk to all kinds of stakeholders, because I just talked about the two biggest economic blocks in the world, but you have very big emitters just below that: India, Indonesia, Mexico, Saudi Arabia, the other ones. And you have all the other countries, the least developed nations, the vulnerable, the small island states, and we need to get all them on board. That's not herding 27 cats, that's herding 191 cats through a very small door. I'm optimistic, but also careful, because we don't have any guarantee to success. And I don't want to raise the stakes even more than they already are, but Glasgow, success in Glasgow is essential for the future of our world, and also a bit more egoistic for the future of a Fit for 55 package. Because you can imagine what happens if Glasgow turns into a failure the size of Copenhagen. Then a lot of Europeans will say, okay, guys, why bother with our 9% of the emissions? Why go through all that trouble, to all these social unrest, to the technological challenges? Let's leave it. And that will be the first step into the abyss. So we've so far successfully avoided that. I'm optimistic that we can keep doing that, but it requires all our attention, all our focus, and all our political capital. I'll leave it at that, and I'm open for your questions.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot also for covering both the internal and the external aspects. Nicely, I think, provides the basis and sets out the whole field that we can discuss. And to start doing that, we have first the discussant, Claire Dupont from Ghent University. So Claire, perhaps you kick off. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I already see that there are questions flowing in, so there's a lot of active members of our audience today, so I'm not going to take too much time with my questions. I do find it was a very interesting overview you gave, also reminding us particularly of the context within which the European Green Deal has evolved. It's definitely been turbulent times, as Sebastian mentioned earlier, and also reminding how the European Green Deal has survived and even perhaps as you mentioned, has gained some, has been put on steroids in an effort to respond to the particular crisis that we're going through. And that's a very interesting context to think about, because that is, of course, a European context, but also a global context. And I think what your introductory words really showed is how the internal European context and the global context really interact very strongly when it comes to climate politics. And I think I'm going to maybe focus somehow on how these two interact and question you a little bit on how these two interact in my questions. I was one of those people who was watching the State of the European Union speech this morning, and I saw already some comments from certain members of the Parliament, members of the European Parliament and others, that the climate crisis was not so strongly featured in this speech today. And in some ways that makes sense, since the legislative package is still under negotiation. But there was a clear discussion about social justice in an internal and an external context that also connects to the discussion about vaccines and vaccine distribution that we've seen. So there are a lot of questions, I think, that are legitimate that can be raised about how the European Union itself has been behaving towards other nations, vulnerable nations, when it comes to the COVID-19 crisis, how the global community has or has not, and how there can be a trust built in advance of COP26 in Glasgow, particularly because we see recently some considerable concerns about the ability of representatives of vulnerable nations or developing nations to really adequately be able to participate in the COP. From what I hear from your comments, Frans Timmermans would be very busy these next weeks, and I would be interested in hearing more about how he sees the role of bringing these vulnerable countries into a trusting relationship with the rest of the global community, especially when, as you and also President von der Leyen mentioned this morning, there are some of the biggest emitters who are still not yet fulfilling the required ambition. So that would be one of my questions: how to build an atmosphere of trust in the lead up to COP26, and also to try and avoid the situation we had in COP15 in Copenhagen, which led to, I would say, several years of delay in global climate action. Another, I think, important aspect of some of the things also that President von der Leyen mentioned this morning was this question of political will and unity. Not always in the context of climate change, but in the context of migration policy, in the context of European values. The European Union now has to show that it has a soul, in her words, and having political will to take action on difficult questions. And so this is where the internal aspect also really connects with this idea of global governance. What is the European role in the global governance context if inside the EU we face such challenges in overcoming our own unity issues? And one of the things that really struck me also this morning, but also in your words today, is this idea that member states are thinking about taking things out of the legislative package, but you have to be able to replace it with something else. And I'm wondering, is there sufficient political will within the Commission, but also with the Commission's partners, to really push member states to not give them the room for maneuver if necessary, to really push for this political will that was mentioned so much by President von der Leyen this morning. And another aspect of the internal dimension is how it is integrated across policy sectors. And I think there the European Green Deal on paper looks very good. It's all policies and actions need to be in line with the climate neutrality goal and in line with the 2030 goal now that it is embedded in the European climate law. And yet we see policies still somehow being adopted that you can really question. For example, the Common Agricultural Policy, is that really aligned with our climate goals? And many analysts will say no. So how can we overcome this persistent silos in terms of policy making inside the EU to also then have an integrated, unified, and an exemplary voice in the global governance context? And the integrated thinking, of course, can also be part of a grand strategy for climate diplomacy, perhaps. Not only that it's up to Mr. Timmermans to bring the climate diplomacy message to his partners, but for all diplomats, whether you're focusing on migration issues in your conversations with other partners, whether it's trade, how much does the climate neutrality goal really feature as a key objective in those external negotiations? These are many thoughts, and I see in the questions and answers that there are several other questions and comments that will build on some of these, and there are many other themes that we could address. But I really want to thank you for those interesting comments, and I'm looking forward to the discussion that follows.
Thanks a
Okay,
lot.
thank you.
Thanks a lot. Let me briefly perhaps try to structure the debate a little bit, because I'm wondering, I don't know whether you have been following the questions also in the question and answer box, and several of them indeed relate. And please out there add your other questions and answers. I'm now, since we have so many on the table, I'm wondering whether we can call on you, but if you want to take the floor, raise the hand. Otherwise, pose your question in the question and answer section. There are some questions that are more about the external side of things, although we know external and internal are interconnected, as you both have emphasized. And perhaps I raise a few of the international ones if we want to cover that first. I don't know. Perhaps that's an idea. So Lea Pilsner from E3G asked about externalizing the Green Deal, that is of vital interest for the EU on multiple levels. And basically what the prospects are for the development of a dedicated European Green Deal diplomacy. How we would further respond to the Foreign Affairs Council conclusions earlier this year in this context, including making sure external initiatives like Global Gateway add up and are used to promote decarbonization. I think another question relates also, and that is asking about the carbon adjustment mechanism. It's perhaps not a surprise that comes, but I think it is this kind of atmosphere of trust, etc. So how does that work together? And then there's also a question about Turkey, the Western Balkans, and what how they will be integrated into the European Green Deal as a growth strategy. So perhaps start with the international ones first, and then we can perhaps go to the more internal ones if that's feasible. Please, floor is yours.
Let's see. I also want to respond to Claire's point a little. So let me try and sort of be as concise but also complete as possible, and then I no doubt forget half of it, but you will remind me. Because indeed, making Glasgow into a success is about more than this morning's financial pledge, although it's very important. And I do think it's one of the vital elements of distrust that has been building up in the last 10 years, I should say, since Cancun, where we promised, Mexico, where 2010, where we promised to deliver on that 100 billion. And we obviously repeated that in Paris. But the original promise is already on the table for more than 10 years. And obviously the benchmark year was 2020, which is past. And we haven't met it. And so the developing world, especially the most vulnerable and least developed countries, are completely justified in their anger and their distrust. So not for nothing, that was the most prominent part of the speech this morning in terms of climate, of the climate aspect, pledging that money and calling upon the other partners to fill the gap, because we know that that is essential. And since COVID, there's another gap, which is the vaccines gap. And it's a bit of a sobering thought that we haven't been able to show any solidarity over there, nothing. And also that was not a real contested issue within Europe. I mean, normally, if it's about money, development aid, you can sort of draw the lines. The left and the progressives are calling to give more to the rest of the world, and the conservatives are sort of pushing that back a little. That's the traditional conundrum. On vaccines, I haven't heard anybody, really nobody. And we have all to look inside ourselves and come to the conclusion that sharing your wealth is an effort, doable. Sharing your health is something we are not willing to do, and obviously the rest of the world sees that, which is a painful fact, but it's something we have to live with. Okay, so we go for the most cynical way forward, and we vaccinate the people that come to Glasgow, which is also a bit cynical to know that most of those people are already vaccinated, because within developing nations, human beings are just as we are. So the people that organize it for themselves are already vaccinated, and which is most of the times government cycles. So, but well, that's the cynical truth that we have. Luckily, we can grow literally beyond that, because we can now grow to producing capacities that go well beyond the amount of people living on this planet. So after we vaccinated ourselves in the most egoistic way possible, we are now ready to vaccinate the rest of the world, and we better hurry up. Also for egoistic reasons, by the way. I can't make this into a more beautiful story. There's no such thing as a very high European morale on this. There was actually none on planet Earth. But moving further on indeed, how we build that coalition, and I should say how we repair that coalition, because traditionally, and I've witnessed every COP from number 1 to number 25, originally there was that traditional bondage between the European Union and the least developed countries, the small island states, etc. And that has suffered a little, for understandable reasons. The US finally, you should say for a good reason, because the US finally joined on stage. And I've seen it happening around me. The whole of Europe was mesmerized and applauding the announcement by Biden. While the rest of the world, these developed countries, are still pretty wary and anxious about the role of the US in the whole UNFCCC. You don't win your trust back by one announcement. Come on. So there is a sort of a confusion on where the EU is. Well, let me be very clear on that. We are right in front, behind, or with the least developed nations and the small island states, the vulnerable countries in this world. And that was shown this morning, because we didn't cuddle up with the US. We challenged them explicitly. It's pretty rare in a State of the Union that you challenge such powerful partners in such an explicit way, say, hey guys, you have to step up to the plate now. Fine what you did with the ambition, but now time to deliver. I do hope, and I do know that that helps. And not for nothing, the travel itinerary of the EVP Timmermans will have a lot of those countries on the list in order to also physically show our allegiance to them. Now on what we do with our climate diplomacy and how we externalize our Green Deal. First of all, that's not a very popular habit seen by the rest of the world. The EU externalizing its values, its policies to the rest of the world has always been met with some skepticism. You could say, yes, rightfully so, because why is our way of life the best one on Earth? But we do acknowledge that the climate challenge is a planetary one. So whatever they think, whatever other countries think, we're going to pursue with externalizing our climate policy, aka creating a global Green Deal. And we're going to use every lever in our toolbox. Some of them are pretty small. Some of them are somewhat powerful. The most powerful one is obviously that we are the biggest consumer market in the world. So if you have a product and you want to sell it somewhere, you better go to Europe, because that's where the purchasing power of the world is. And we can use that in our trade policies and with new instruments as what we call the carbon border adjustment mechanism. It is really a conversation topic. It really gets the discussion going, because if we go abroad, Number 1, 2, and 3, and by the way, also number 4 on the agenda is the carbon border adjustment mechanism. And the first question is, how can we avoid that? And our answer is pretty simple. Price the carbon, just as we do at home. And you will be, there won't be any harassment. You won't be met with any paperwork. You can just go along into Europe. If your industry pays the same amount for carbon emissions as our industry, we're fine. And that is the essence of it. Actually, our industry at the moment pays the same price for carbon as industries in other parts of the world, being zero, because we have free allowances that we give out to our industry when they are at risk of competition from industries in the rest of the world. So we have a level playing field, but on a very low level. What we need to do is raise the playing field. So what we used to do was basically say, okay, this is not level. We lower the playing field of the European Union. Fine. So free allowances. Now we're going to do something different. We're going to increase their playing field, which is CBAM. So if you arrive from somewhere in the world and you arrive in Europe, at the border, you have to pay, and here you are. And that's the same level playing field that everybody wants, that the WTO requires, but on a higher level. And I do think it is going to be a very successful instrument. It might be as successful as nuclear deterrence, and I mean, we never have to use it because we found a better way to solve this issue, and that is if every country already has paid, then they arrive in Europe on the same level and they don't have to pay extra. And we see that happening in the rest of the world, not at breakneck speed. It's not easy to have emission trading systems or carbon taxes or whatever, but we see up to China, we see the first emission trading systems, carbon taxing systems, Canada, New Zealand, others. So I have high hopes that we can get there. And that's only one of the other instruments in the toolbox, and I can go into all kinds of examples, but in the interest of time, let me yield back to you.
Thanks. Perhaps just one further question on this, and I don't want this to be a CBAM discussion, as it easily gets. But obviously, you were talking about, okay, we're offering additional money, but then there's the CBAM, and you have talked about how the reaction is when you travel elsewhere, or I guess talk virtually to people elsewhere. Is there a danger that the mix gets kind of polluted by the CBAM and dominated by the CBAM? And how can one counter that? One can obviously counter it like President von der Leyen did today and say, well, we actually have also some positive things to say here, additional money. But is that, in your view, possible, easily done, or so to avoid that the CBAM kind of dominates the debates also externally?
Yeah, it does, and I actually don't want to avoid it because it's, as I said, it's a very fruitful conversation topic to get to the heart of the matter, which is worldwide climate policy. But obviously, before you get there, you have some difficult and tense conversations. But we have experience. I mean, this is not the first barrier we throw up against products from elsewhere. We have a lot of tariff barriers, we have non-tariff barriers, and we have always approached it in a sort of similar way. We say to rich countries, we say deal with it, and to poor countries, we say we help you meet it. So we help you to meet the requirements that we put up for our own food, for instance. If we oblige importers to come with healthy food because we don't want to give our consumers unhealthy stuff. Some of the countries have difficulty getting rid of the pesticides, etc., that they were used to use. We're not going to give them the exemption to import unhealthy stuff. We're going to give them the help to get rid of those pesticides. With pesticides, it's pretty easy. With steel, it's obviously a bit bigger and a bit more complicated, but it's the same principle. So what we hope to be able to do is also get into that conversation with least developed countries and others that have difficulty and still have the need to have the possibility to export their products to Europe, to help them meeting the obligations that we require them to meet. So is it another shift in our development aid? But I think it's a welcome one and a badly needed one.
Thanks. Let me try to summarize at least a few of the questions that perhaps go more towards internal policy matters. And Claire was already talking about the challenge of creating internal unity or agreement eventually on the package. There are questions about, in the chat or in the question and answer, the transition fund, the social climate fund. Will this be kind of enough, and will it work to actually cover the rising costs of the transition in a well, also I guess socially equitable way? There's a general question I think that links to that, how we can get the social acceptance for the measures and for the transition. And then there's a very interesting question also whether the current governance structure of the EU can be an obstacle for the implementation of the Green Deal. I guess that goes to things like unanimity requirements on certain parts, etc. So perhaps if you can elaborate a little bit on those matters. Thanks.
Yeah, the social dimension. So back to Europe, back to ourselves. Here we are. We have quite a challenge, social challenge, and I can already tell you, but I'm not telling you anything new, that is by far the biggest challenge within the Green Deal, the social aspects. I wouldn't say putting up enough renewable electricity is easy peasy, but it's easy peasy compared to this addressing the social challenge that we have, because every transition, also the ones in the past, the first and the second and the third industrial revolution, all of them had a very Darwinistic nature. They always ended up with more money and more power in the hands of fewer people. And what we did in Europe, and to be honest, pretty successful, we can be proud of that, we managed to repair the damage afterwards. With the rise of the social movement, the labor unions, social democracy, we created that social market economy that sort of eases out all those differences and tries to compensate for the Darwinistic nature of societal change. This time, we cannot afford that choreography. We cannot make the transition first and then repair the damage. For two reasons. One of them is this transition is way bigger than the other ones. This is about whole society. This is not about one industry. This is not about a steam engine or creating cars. This is about everything. So it's way too big to do that. And our European population doesn't accept it anymore. And they're right. So what we need to do is embed the social aspects of the transition in the transition itself. And here's our social climate fund, which is just one instrument, but a very important one. And the question is, will it be enough? And that's always a question of size and effectiveness. And let me say something about the size first, because there's a lot of misunderstanding about that. But I'm going to give you some headline figures. We talk about extending an emission trading system to built environment, to buildings, and to transport, which is actually affecting our heating bill and our prices that we pay at the gas station. And that affects us all. How much? With 40 billion euros. So the turnover of this emission trading system, this new emission trading system, will be 40 billion euros. Assume that all that price trickles down into the energy bill. Then the collective energy bill of all Europeans together will increase with 40 billion euros a year. It's quite a lot. But most of us are perfectly capable and also willing to pay for that. We are able to pay a little extra for our energy, and we better should. Not all of us. 1/3 of the Europeans, if you take the biggest definition, 1/3 of the Europeans struggles to pay those bills. So 13 billion euros needs to be compensated somehow, somewhere. We have a fund, the Social Climate Fund, with a size of 20 billion euros a year, if you add the European and the co-financing together. So it's enough. Way more than enough. Well, that better be, because we also know that redistributing the money is not going to be full 100% effective. You always spend money to people that actually do not need it. So you need a bit more than that. So 20 billion is much more than 13 billion, and we think we can do it. Not by just transferring the money to member states and say good luck. No, by copying a very successful framework that we just invented. It's the Recovery and Resilience Facility. It's handing a lot of money to member states with a lot of conditionality. So you cannot just spend it. You need strategic plans. You need milestones. You need targets. You only get the money after you meet a target, after you meet a milestone. It's very cumbersome. It's actually very paternalistic from the EU towards its member states, but accepted by all member states because of that trade-off that I earlier explained. Some countries hate to pay, but they love the purpose, what it's paid for. And there's other countries that love to receive money. They hate the strings attached. So both have a dilemma, both have a trade-off, and if you find the right balance, everybody will be just as unhappy, which means you have a compromise. And that happened in those 4 days and 4 nights that we had in July last year to get ourselves with the frugal countries against the cohesion friends to that recovery and resilience facility of 750 billion euros. This is about 10 to 20 billion euros a year for a long period of time. So you could say it's about the same order of magnitude. It's about a just as urgent purpose, climate change versus recovery of the European economy. They're actually connected. I think we can get there. I think Europe is ready, mature enough, experienced enough to make this happen. So the governance of our European Union, I do think it's fine. Formally, we don't have unanimity requirements on almost all parts of this Fit for 55 package. Informally, we all know that the European Council will want to say something about this. And within the European Council, you work with, it's not so much veto power, but you work with consensus. And I think but that's maybe for another discussion, but the concept of consensus, which is somewhere between majority and veto power, is the most European way of taking a decision. And I think we can get pretty far by doing that.
Thanks. Obviously, there's one element, the taxation, that requires unanimity, and there might be a certain trade-off between that one and the emissions trading one for buildings and transport, I guess. So these are perhaps some of the alternatives that you were hinting at it, saying then tell us, member states, how we can do it differently. It's now more a collection of things that perhaps haven't been answered yet. Perhaps you actually answered one of them, because there was a question about the recovery plans of the member states and how the Commission will ensure that actually the minimum spending requirements for climate-related spending will be adhered to and in a sensible way. I guess you already talked about that. There is a question about, well, I don't know whether you want to talk about that. Can you tell a bit more about industry lobbying versus NGO lobbying in the Green Deal and Fit for 55? And then there is a specific question, I guess that's also that's more external and perhaps triggered by recent media reports. What else is in the mix of cooperation with the US and perhaps also China now with reports about the global methane pledge, so addressing methane emissions? So perhaps a little bit going beyond CBAM and financing. So what else is out there if you feel like it? Perhaps this would then be the last round. Thanks very much.
On lobbying, it's interesting to see things happening, especially within the industries. We are sort of used to being stormed or lobbied, whatever you call it, but I sometimes feel that this building is stormed by external stakeholders, like Business Europe, etc. So the big umbrella organizations. And they seem, and I don't blame them because that's the nature of those organizations, they seem to lobby for the lowest common denominator. so the average of their memberships, etc. So what we see more and more is all kinds of different coalitions or even single companies calling us and say, yeah, we know that there's industry out there that says, please slow down your ambition, but don't ramp up your ambition, because we think we can win on that wave of new technology and new innovation. We think we can be a front runner in the world, and we know that that makes a difference for the future, for the better, in terms of profit and jobs and whatever, and also planet, by the way. And a lot of companies have internalized their people, planet, profit, ESG, whatever talks from merely a communication tool, nice for the yearly report, to really internalizing it. And that takes a while. And I don't blame anybody, any organization. I mean, changing organizations, changing countries, changing a continent takes a while. But I'm pretty optimistic about what happens. And I'm also pretty optimistic about the strength of the NGOs. I shouldn't say too much about that. I'm brought up in one of those. But I think they're kicking us around the room big time, and they're doing a good job doing that. And they should keep doing that, by the way, because that's how we stay sharp, by being challenged all the time. But I want to tell you one aspect of it that really struck me in the last 2 years, and that is actually the reason for my intrinsic optimism. In all those conversations with people that think they are very important, and sometimes they are, by the way, so high civil servants, ministers, CEOs of very big companies, in all those conversations, at one point, it turns literally to their own children. And that was not happening 10 years ago, but now it is, because those children sitting at the kitchen table are asking questions. Small ones about eating meat. Why? Bigger ones about why do we go to Bali on a holiday? Do we have to fly that far around the planet? But also existential ones. Hey, Dad, what are you doing to save my future? And if that dad happens to be the CEO of BMW, I can tell you that's a pretty existential question. And the whole thing is, and we all experience it if we have children ourselves. I mean, take that CEO, a bad headline in the press is a bad day. A bad shareholders meeting, that's a bad day. But not being able to answer your own children, that's more than just a bad day. And I do think that that is the intrinsic driver of our change. So it's not about better politicians or better policymakers. It's about society where something is happening. Sometimes slowly, sometimes faster, sometimes structural and fundamental. And this time it's fast and fundamental because it's our children. That's pretty fundamental, and they move pretty fast. So in terms of lobby, which is always sort of associated with bad things and watering down ambition and slowing things down and driving blockades on the road, actually, I do think that we've been pushed forward by it to a large extent. So I do think that's our main, that explains my main optimism. Also, I'm optimistic about technology, and there's reason to be optimistic about, if you look at the mind-boggling speed of solar energy and wind and electrical cars, that is great reason for optimism, and that's a factor that drives change too. But I do think the most fundamental one is the urge that is felt within our society at the most important place, which is the young generation.
That sounds like a great positive last word. I'm sure we haven't exhausted all the questions that were posed on climate policy integration and problems to get it in the agricultural policy. But let's not open more problems after these nice words. And indeed, I think for many of us who are also more on the observing side, some of the changes that we have gone through at the European level and EU climate policy over the past decade have been pretty amazing. If you see how emission-intensive industries have moved, how now big parts of automobile industry seem to move. So there are big changes that sometimes are much quicker than many of us thought was possible. So I would like to thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us. I would just want to point out that obviously this is the beginning of a whole conference series of events. We will be able in several of the other events to, I think, dig a little bit deeper. For example, tomorrow on trade policy, I'm sure the CBAM will come up again. And so there will be a whole series. Please have a look out there at govtran.eu for the whole series. Register what you're interested in. And we will be looking for you, and we'll be happy to welcome you back to one of our other events. Many, many thanks to you, Diederik, and good luck with pushing this agenda forward with COP26 and the Fit for 55 package. And I'm looking forward to the next occasion to exchange views. Thanks very much.